Don't worry, mi amor, we will find him. Wait, I see him!
The last thing Rosa Vega did before leaving for work that morning was help her son find his missing stuffed dog. It was under the couch. It was always under the couch. She handed it to him, kissed the top of his head, told him she'd be home by 7, and walked out the door. 5 hours later, the FBI would storm a Mafia wedding, and Rosa Vega would be the reason.
FBI, clear the area! Hands where I can see them! Nobody move! Get down on the ground! Secure all exits now!
The ballroom had cost $340,000 to dress. Real flowers, not silk, not foam, actual living things flown in from 3 different countries, arranged so precisely that the head florist had slept on site for 2 nights to make sure nothing wilted before the ceremony. The linens were hand-pressed. The chandeliers had been cleaned crystal by crystal. Every table had been measured to the inch. By 2:31 in the afternoon, it was a federal crime scene. 47 guests were being held in the lobby. The groom was in handcuffs on the sidewalk outside, still in his tuxedo, tie loosened, saying nothing to anyone. Chairs were overturned. A champagne glass had shattered on the marble floor, and nobody had cleaned it up, which Rosa, even then, even in the middle of all of it, couldn't help noticing. The federal agents kept asking about one person in those first chaotic minutes. Not the groom, not the bride's father. A 34-year-old hotel housekeeper who had clocked in at 6:47 that morning, the same time she always clocked in, and who was supposed to be completely invisible. She wasn't supposed to matter. That was the whole point. But here's what nobody could figure out in those first hours, and what took investigators 3 more weeks to fully understand. Rosa Vega didn't stumble into any of this. She didn't trip over something she wasn't meant to see, and panic and call someone. What happened in that ballroom was the result of a decision she made alone, in her kitchen, in the dark, 3 days before the wedding. And something happened in those 3 days that almost made her walk away entirely. Stay with me, because by the time this is over, you're going to understand exactly what Rosa Vega knew, exactly what she was willing to risk, and exactly why the most dangerous person in that room was the one nobody ever looked at twice. Rosa had come to Chicago from Puebla, Mexico at 26, with her son Marco strapped to her chest in a carrier, 11 months old and sleeping for most of the flight. She'd gotten the job at the Alderton Grand Hotel through a cousin who worked the kitchen there, started in laundry, moved to housekeeping within 8 months because she was fast and because she never had to be told something twice. 6 years later, she knew that building the way people only know the places they've spent more hours in than their own homes. She knew which elevator ran slow in the mornings. She knew which linen closet had a broken latch. She knew which guests tipped, and which ones left their rooms looking like a search warrant had already been executed. She sent $340 to her mother in Puebla every 2 weeks. Not 300, not 350, 340, because that was the number she'd calculated left her enough for Marco's school supplies, the grocery runs, and a small buffer for the emergencies that came whether or not you planned for them. Marco was 9 now. He still had the stuffed dog, Pero, because he'd named it at age 3 and the name had stuck, that Rosa had bought at a gas station the night his fever hit 103, and she'd been too scared to leave him long enough to get to an actual store. One eye missing. Stuffing shifted into a lump on one side that Marco said made it better for holding. She'd offered to replace it twice. He'd looked at her like she'd suggested replacing him. She kept a handwritten cleaning checklist in the front pocket of her apron. 6 years into this job, she didn't need it. She kept it anyway, because there was something about crossing things off in pen, a physical record of what she'd gotten done, that made the days feel manageable. Small order inside large chaos. 3 weeks before the wedding, Rosa was assigned to the Alderton's premier ballroom suite for an extended prep rotation. She'd done it before. Management assigned one person to own a space ahead of major private bookings, and Rosa was reliable. She noticed things out of place. That last part is going to matter more than anything else in this story. She didn't know who the event was for. Hotel policy with private bookings at this level meant cleaning staff weren't told. She knew the event was large, formal, expensive in specific ways. Not just the quality of what was being brought in, but the care with which it was being arranged. Real flowers. That was the thing she clocked on day 1. All real. More of them than she'd ever seen in one room. On her third day in the ballroom, she noticed one of the large floral arrangements had been moved, shifted, not dramatically, maybe 3 feet, and repositioned against a section of wall she hadn't been asked to clean. She thought about mentioning it, didn't. Filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, the way you file away small things that don't quite fit. She didn't know yet what she'd actually just noticed. There was a man she kept seeing, not a guest, not hotel management. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, unremarkable looking, the kind of face that doesn't give you anything to hold on to, and he appeared in her peripheral vision more than a person reasonably should. The first time she noticed him, he was standing near the ballroom's east corridor, reading something on his phone. The second time, he was in the lobby off the service entrance, buying a coffee from the cart, not drinking it, just holding it. The third time, he was in the parking structure near her car when she was leaving at the end of her shift, and he looked up when she walked past, and then immediately looked away. Rosa noted him the way she noted everything, filed it, kept moving. She also started noticing the other men, the ones doing advanced security work, moving through the ballroom space and the connecting corridors with a specific kind of attention, measuring angles, checking sightlines, noting exits. Security. That was the obvious read. High-end private events sometimes brought their own teams for advance work. She mentioned it to Gil, a maintenance worker 19 years into the Alderton, who Rosa trusted because he'd never once tried to make conversation with her when she clearly didn't want any. Gil said yes. The security presence was a little elevated, but it made sense. This was a Cavendish event. Old Chicago money. The Cavendish family had been booking the Alderton's premier suite for special occasions for over 20 years. Private, careful, generous with the hotel. Nothing to worry about. Rosa accepted that. It made the pieces fit. She went back to work. What she didn't know, what none of the hotel's general staff knew, was that the booking hadn't come through the Cavendish name in any way that mattered. The initial reservation, the deposit, the entire financial chain behind this event traced back through a shell company registered in Nevada 11 months earlier. The Cavendish name was on the surface of this thing, the way paint is on a wall, there to make you stop looking. Rosa didn't know that. But something else happened that day that she couldn't explain away as cleanly as Gil had explained the security. Behind the cast iron radiator in the prep corridor that ran adjacent to the ballroom's service entrance, tucked in the narrow gap between the radiator and the wall, visible only if you were down on your knees cleaning the baseboard, was a cell phone. Not a lost and found situation. A burner. No case, no identifying marks. The kind of phone that exists specifically to be used and then discarded. But it hadn't been discarded. It had been placed. Rosa stood up, looked both ways down the corridor. A single flower petal, one of the real ones, ivory, slightly curled at the edge, had drifted from the ballroom and settled on the floor 2 feet from the radiator. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone in her apron pocket and kept going. She told herself she'd hand it in at the front desk at the end of her shift. She did not hand it in at the end of her shift. The next morning she arrived at the ballroom, unlocked the service entrance with her keycard, and went to hang up her jacket in the staff closet off the corridor. The handwritten checklist that had been in her apron pocket the day before was sitting on the center table of the ballroom. She had not left it there. It had been in her apron when she clocked out. Her apron had been in the staff closet overnight. The closet required a keycard. Rosa stood in the middle of that ballroom for a long moment, looking at her own handwriting on that piece of paper, sitting on a table she'd cleaned the day before. Then she picked it up, put it back in her apron, started crossing things off. She did not mention it to anyone, but on her way to the east corridor that morning, she passed the wall panel, the one the moved floral arrangement had been sitting against, and she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint smudge on the wall, at the panel's edge, like a fingerprint, like someone had pressed their hand there, steadying themselves while they worked quickly in the dark. She kept walking, but she didn't stop thinking about it. 3 days before the wedding, that's where the countdown starts. Rosa turned on the burner phone in her car in the employee parking structure. Just enough battery left. No messages, no contacts. One photograph in the camera roll, time-stamped 11 days earlier at 4:17 in the morning. The photograph was taken inside the ballroom. You could tell from the floor, the baseboards, the shape of the windows. And it showed the floral arrangement pushed aside, and the wall panel behind it partially open. And scratched into the drywall inside that opening, rough and deliberate, A name. Elena Vasquez. Rosa stared at that name for a long time. Then she did what anyone does when they have a name and a bad feeling. She searched. Elena Vasquez, Chicago. Returned almost nothing. One result that mattered. A 3-paragraph item from a local news aggregator, dated 6 years ago. A woman, 29 years old, found in the Chicago River near the 18th Street Bridge. Cause of death listed as undetermined pending investigation. No follow-up article. No inquest coverage. No family quoted. 3 paragraphs, and then nothing. In the way that only happens when someone makes very sure that nothing is all there will be. Rosa sat in that parking structure for 41 minutes. Now, 48 hours before the ceremony. She needed to know whose wedding this actually was. It took her 3 days and a careful conversation with a hotel events coordinator she'd built goodwill with over 6 years to get a name. The groom was Daniel Mercer, 41 years old. Real estate developer. Clean public record. The kind of man who had a Wikipedia stub that mentioned his firm, but not much else. She found him online. Photographs at charity events, handshakes with city officials, a profile in a Chicago business publication from 2 years ago. In every image, Daniel Mercer looked like someone who was very comfortable being looked at. A tall man with careful eyes and a smile that arrived on his face a half-second before anything actually amusing had been said. Charming in the practiced way, the kind of charm that is really just very good attention management. His real estate firm had processed $47 million in transactions over the previous 4 years. The same Chicago business profile had noted, in a single paragraph buried near the end of the piece, that the volume of transactions was difficult to reconcile with the firm's actual project portfolio, which could account for roughly a third of that figure. The journalist had not followed up. The paragraph sat there in the archived article, like a question nobody had asked out loud. Rosa didn't know the word for what she was reading, but she understood what it meant. 20 hours before the ceremony, Rosa made a mistake. A reasonable one, but a mistake. She started watching Gil. Gil had been the one to name the event. Gil had explained away the security. Gil had been at the Alderton for 19 years, which meant Gil had been there through previous Sorrento-connected bookings Rosa didn't know about yet. For 36 hours, she became half convinced that Gil was the inside man. That the phone, the checklist, the fingerprint on the wall panel, all of it traced back to a 19-year maintenance worker who knew every inch of the building. She followed him on a coffee break, watched him talk to one of the advanced security men near the service entrance. Her heart rate climbed. Then she saw what they were actually talking about. The security man was showing Gil a photograph of a burst pipe fitting, asking whether the building's plumbing in the East Corridor was original or replaced. Gil was pointing at the ceiling. They were talking about water pressure. It wasn't Gil. It was never Gil. But that mistake cost her 36 hours. And 36 hours before a wedding is not a lot of time. She went back to the one thing she actually had, the bride. The bride's family, the Sorrento family, based in a suburb of Chicago, ran a legitimate food distribution company that supplied restaurants across the Midwest. A compound in Oak Park, a fleet of trucks, a payroll with 300 names on it. They also had a reputation, in certain circles, that had never quite made it to a courtroom. The kind of reputation that arrives in a room before you do and leaves after you've gone. The Sorrentos weren't celebrating a wedding, they were closing a merger. Daniel Mercer wasn't marrying into a family. He was being absorbed into an operation. The security teams measuring sightlines in that ballroom weren't protecting guests. They were protecting the transaction. And then something happened that changed everything Rosa thought she understood about who was watching her. She found a photograph tucked behind the seam of her staff closet's interior lining. A gap she'd never looked at closely before. A printed photograph. Rosa, from a distance, walking Marco to school. Taken from across the street. Dated 18 days ago. Someone had been watching her since before she found the phone. Which meant the phone wasn't an accident. The phone was left for her to find. That kitchen table wasn't to go to the police. It was to go back. She returned to the hotel the next morning with the burner phone and one question she hadn't been able to answer yet. Who had left it? The photograph wasn't a threat. She understood that now, in the cold clarity of a night spent not sleeping. If the Sorrento family had wanted to warn Rosa off, Rosa would not have been warned. She would have simply been gone. The photograph was something else. It was a confirmation. We know who you are and we chose you. Here's what you have to understand about what Rosa was looking at in that image of herself walking her son to school. She wasn't scared in the way you'd expect. She was furious, because whoever left it thought it would make her stop. They had calculated, based on what they'd watched, based on what they knew, that showing her that photograph would shut her down, that she'd see Marco's face and go quietly back to crossing things off her list. The opposite happened, because what the photograph told Rosa, once the fury had cleared enough for her to think, was that whoever left the phone was not the Sorrento family. This was someone inside that operation, someone who wanted something disrupted at this wedding, and who had selected Rosa specifically for reasons that had nothing to do with chance. Everything she'd read as accidental, the checklist on the table, the phone behind the radiator, the floral arrangement moved on her third day so she'd notice the wall panel, none of it was accidental. She hadn't stumbled into this. She'd been handed a door, and someone had been watching long enough to know she'd walk through it. The question that replaced all the others, the one that now sat at the center of everything. The person who chose her, were they still alive? And would they be by the time this wedding happened? The man she kept seeing was named Victor Salinas. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out. There was a note under her car's windshield wiper when she walked to the employee parking structure at the end of her shift. A room number, 412, written in the same handwriting as the addition at the bottom of her checklist. She looked around the parking structure. Nobody visible. The unremarkable man, the one who'd been in her peripheral vision for weeks, the coffee he never drank, the phone he wasn't reading, was gone. But she understood, with a certainty she couldn't have explained, that he'd been the one to leave it. She had 2 days. She went to room 412. The man inside was 44 years old. He looked, in that moment, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was finally close enough to the destination that he could feel his arms shaking. His name was Victor Salinas. He worked as an accountant for the Sorrento organization's food distribution operation. Had for 11 years. That meant 11 years of sitting inside the machinery of a criminal enterprise and watching it run. He knew every number. He knew what the numbers concealed. And for the previous 14 months, he had been feeding those numbers, carefully, in pieces, to federal investigators building a case that could not afford to fall apart. Victor was the one who'd left the phone. Victor was the one who'd taken the photograph of Rosa walking Marco to school. Not as a threat. As research. He had watched Rosa for 6 weeks before making his decision, because he needed to be certain. Elena Vasquez was Victor's cousin. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a Mercer-affiliated company 6 years ago, and she had found, by accident, in a discrepancy she'd noticed in a late quarterly report, the same kind of financial irregularity Rosa had turned up in her research. The transactions that didn't match the portfolio, the money that had to be coming from somewhere else. Elena had made a mistake. She had gone to Daniel Mercer directly. She had sat across from him, in his office, and told him what she'd found and asked him to explain it. She had trusted that the truth, spoken out loud in the right room, would be enough. 3 weeks later, she was in the Chicago River. Victor had spent 6 years building what Elena couldn't. Because Elena hadn't had documentation. She'd had suspicion, courage, and a confrontation that made her visible at exactly the wrong moment. Victor had spent 6 years making sure the documentation existed and that it was stored somewhere the Sorrentos didn't know to look for it. Behind a wall panel in a ballroom, underneath an arrangement of real flowers, in a room where Rosa Vega crossed things off a handwritten list every single day. She had access. She was trusted. She was invisible to everyone in that building except Victor, who'd spent 6 weeks watching her work and deciding she was exactly what he needed. The physical documents behind the wall panel, financial records, transaction logs, included Daniel Mercer's authorization on payments made during the week Elena Vasquez died, not payments to the people who killed her. Payments that funded the people who funded those people. A chain. The kind that only means something if you have every link. And every link needed to be out of that wall before the wedding ended and the Sorrentos swept the building. Victor looked at Rosa across that hotel room and told her she could walk away. That his FBI handler had arranged it. No consequence. No record of this conversation. Rosa thought about Elena, who had sat across from the wrong person and had not come back. She thought about the difference between what Elena had done and what Victor was asking her to do. Elena had been visible. Rosa was going to stay invisible. Elena had confronted, Rosa was going to carry. The documents already existed. They just needed to move from one place to another, in a 93-second window, in a room where nobody looked at the housekeeper. She needed 47 hours. Then she told the FBI yes. The wedding day. Rosa clocked in at 6:47 a.m. The ballroom was already occupied. A Sorrento catering team, a lighting crew that had arrived in unmarked vans before 6. Florists who knew exactly where every arrangement was supposed to go. Rosa was background noise. Precisely, deliberately, background noise. She noticed the vehicle at 7:12. An unmarked sedan on the side street visible through the ballroom's east-facing windows. Positioned at the exact angle that gave the occupant a direct line of sight to the main entrance. It hadn't moved since she arrived. It wasn't delivery. It wasn't overflow parking. Rosa looked at it for a moment, went back to her list. Daniel Mercer arrived at 10:15 for a final walkthrough. He was taller than he looked in photographs. He moved through the ballroom with the particular confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether a room would accommodate him. He spoke to the lighting coordinator about the chandelier angles. He corrected the placement of 2 centerpieces himself, moving them with precise, unhurried hands. When one of the Sorrento security team approached him with a question, he answered without looking up from the table he was examining, and the security man accepted this without comment. At one point he walked the length of the east wall. The wall with the panel. The wall where Elena's name was scratched in the drywall behind 6 layers of concealment, and he ran his hand along the floral arrangement there without pausing. He looked at the flowers. Just the flowers. Real ones, Rosa noted. The same as always. Ivory. Imported. He walked past Rosa without seeing her. She kept crossing things off her list. At 9:40, the Sorrento florist repositioned the large arrangement back into place against the wall panel. Moved it 3 feet to the right, exactly over the panel. Rosa watched from across the room. The florist didn't look at the wall. Didn't need to. Muscle memory. He'd done this in this room before. At the very bottom of Rosa's checklist, below the last item in her own handwriting, was the room number Victor had written weeks ago. 412. She'd been looking at it every day since it appeared. Today was the last day it needed to matter. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. At 1:51, Rosa Vega set down her mop, straightened her apron, and walked toward room 412. Victor was there. He looked at her for a long moment, said nothing, and then gave her a small nod. The FBI handler, a woman Rosa had met twice, was on the phone in the corner. She ended the call when Rosa came in, looked at her, and also said nothing. There was nothing left to say. They'd already said it. At 1:58 p.m., the Sorrento florist moved the floral arrangement aside for the ceremonial photographs. Standard procedure. Part of the event timeline. The wall panel was exposed for 93 seconds. Rosa was 3 feet away, straightening the service station near the east corridor entrance, and not one person in that ballroom looked at her. She retrieved the documents, slipped them inside her apron, next to the handwritten checklist, walked to the service corridor at a pace that was not hurried, because hurried would have been wrong, and Rosa Vega did not do things wrong. She handed the documents to a federal agent in the service corridor at 2:08 p.m. The first agents entered the ballroom at 2:19. 6 of them, through 4 separate doors simultaneously. There was a single moment, a strange, suspended second, where the room didn't understand what was happening. Guests turning, security reaching for radios, hands going to earpieces, a chair going over, somebody's champagne glass hitting the marble floor and shattering. Then it understood all at once. A woman screamed near the entrance. 2 of the Sorrento security men moved toward the main door and stopped when they registered how many agents were already there. The bride's father stood from his table at the front of the room and looked, for one moment, like a man who had planned for every contingency and had simply not planned for this one. Daniel Mercer did not run. He stood very still in the center of that room, surrounded by $340,000 of real flowers, the lighting his team had calibrated to the degree, the pressed linens, the crystal chandeliers, and he looked like a man who understood, in this specific moment, exactly how long this moment had been coming. He was in handcuffs on the sidewalk outside at 2:31. The bride's father at 2:44. The Sorrento operation, which had run through Chicago for 11 years and moved money through 3 states and 2 foreign accounts, began to come apart on a Tuesday afternoon in a room full of imported flowers. Now here's what I need you to sit with, because it reframes something you heard at the very beginning of this story. The flowers. Real flowers, flown in from 3 countries, more of them than Rosa had ever seen in one room. The details she had noted on her very first day in that ballroom, 3 weeks before any of this happened. What nobody knew, what only came out in the federal investigation 3 weeks after the arrests, was that the Sorrento family hadn't insisted on real flowers. Daniel Mercer had. Every major event connected to this operation, every significant occasion in his professional life for the past 6 years, had been decorated with real flowers. Not silk, not foam, actual living things. Because Elena Vasquez had told him, once, early in their relationship before he understood what she'd found, that she loved real flowers. That silk ones always looked like an apology for the real thing. He had never stopped ordering them. After everything he had done, and everything he had covered, and 6 years of building a life and a business on top of what she knew and who she was, he had kept ordering real flowers for every room that mattered. A vanity so small and so monstrous it almost doesn't make sense until it does. The ballroom that ended his life was dressed exactly the way he'd always dressed it. For a woman whose name was written in the wall. If this story reached you, if you're sitting with that last part the way I am every time I come back to it, please subscribe to this channel right now. These are the stories that don't make the front page. The ones that happen in the background of rooms we were never invited into, carried by people no one thought to watch. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Rosa had 2 choices. Walk away and stay safe, or carry something that might protect the next person who found what Elena found. She made her decision alone at a kitchen table in the dark. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Victor Salinas entered witness protection 6 days after the wedding. He left Chicago with a different name and a photograph of Elena that he'd been carrying in his wallet for 6 years. The people who made sure Elena's case went nowhere had lawyers in 3 states, and those lawyers were very good. The federal case was airtight in ways that mattered, and complicated in ways that would take years to fully resolve. That's how these things work. You don't get to watch the ending the same day you watch the beginning. Rosa Vega returned to work the following Monday. Same hallway, same cart, same apron. She unlocked the service entrance with her key card and walked to the supply room to start the morning the way she always started it. She pulled out the handwritten checklist, a new one, the old one having traveled through federal hands and into an evidence file, and began to write out the day's tasks. She got through the list the same way she always did, 1 item at a time, pen, not pencil, because pencil felt temporary. At the bottom, after the last task, she paused, and then she wrote 1 more item, in the space below everything else. Pay attention. She crossed it off immediately. There's another story coming on this channel about someone else the room forgot to watch. Someone who was present for decisions they were never supposed to understand. They were wrong about that too. Elena Vasquez's case was reopened on a Thursday. Nobody sent flowers.